Alison Tandry here of DIY Salvation with my introduction to another one of Dennis Stevens's 90s lectures. Don't let the title of this lecture lead you to believe that this is an introductory lecture for those new to TROM, as it is certainly not. Those unfamiliar with Scientology terminology will most certainly get lost listening to this lecture. Even some former Scientologists will. This is because understanding this lecture not only requires you understand some Scientology terminology, but ironically enough, you'll have to understand some TROM concepts as well, as he drops some advanced concepts from both subjects right in your lap partway through the lecture. It's been a common mistake that some versions of the Resolution of the Mind a Games manual by Dennis Stevens have this lecture as an introductory chapter. Believe me, this is not a proper introduction to TROM, but is more of an explanation of how TROM was developed for those who know the subject pretty well, regardless of the original intent of this work. To make this lecture the first contact someone has with the subject of TROM is indisputably a knucklehead idea, yet it has been perpetuated throughout the history of TROM, and is a major factor in TROM remaining an obscure subject for so long. Dennis will make reference to what's known as GPM. That stands for Goals Problem Mass. The simplest definition for it would be the mass that forms in the mind as a result of two conflicting intentions or identities. Here is where we find a fundamental difference between Scientology and TROM. Scientology handles the identities and the intentions, or postulates, in conflict. TROM handles only the intentions, or as we like to say more often, the postulates or goals. For a full explanation of how TROM technology works better because we only handle intentions, and not the identities in conflict, you can watch the video on our channel titled Examining the Goals Problem Mass from our TROM vs. Scientology playlist. I also recommend watching our video Returning in Dianetics vs. Timebreaking in TROM first so you can get a firmer grasp on what Dennis is talking about when he addresses such subjects as engrams, the reactive mind, what analytical constructs in the analytical mind are, and so on. Minimally, you will need to know the basics of TROM, such as what goals packages are and how they are handled, and if you don't have any sort of background in Scientology and you haven't watched the videos I just mentioned, a good portion of this lecture just won't make sense to you. Once again, this is not a beginner-level presentation, and those watching for the first time would do best to go straight to the Start Here playlist, which can be accessed from our channel's homepage, or visit bettertrom.com and start reading TROM 2023. I'm going to review some concepts and terminology before we begin, as even someone with a background in TROM might not be familiar with all of the following. As many of us know, L. Ron Hubbard started with the book Dianetics. This book is commonly referred to as Book 1. In that work, he talked about the reactive mind, which is also known as the reactive bank or just the bank, which is the hidden, irrational mind of the individual, as opposed to the rational mind, the analytical mind, which the individual is aware of. The reactive mind records engrams, which are moments of trauma and upset. The upsetting content of the engram in the reactive mind is re-stimulated by conditions in the environment that are similar to the content of the engram. The moment of re-stimulation is what's called a lock, and exists in the analytical mind. These locks cause the individual to have aberrations, which by definition are departures from rational thought. If the person is in surroundings that are re-stimulative to him, in other words, his engrams are in constant re-stimulation, his condition, or case, will worsen. These engrams can be handled with Dianetics auditing. It's a process where an auditor, the Dianetics practitioner, will have the individual confront the engrams and reduce the harmful effect of such on the individual, with the ultimate goal of a state known as clear where the individual has no engrams. Thus, the person engaged in Dianetics with an auditor is called a pre-clear. Dennis will use the term co-audit in this lecture, and that's when two people get together and take turns being auditor and pre-clear so they can both achieve the state of clear. It was Hubbard's assertion that this process of handling engrams in the pre-clear's mind could not be done solo. Because the reactive mind, whether it's receiving an engram or one is in re-stimulation, will cut out the functioning of the analytical mind, you would need a separate practitioner to guide the pre-clear through handling his engrams, as he would not have the analytical capacity to do such himself. Hubbard did come up with techniques to handle the locks, resulting in the restimulation of engrams that could be performed solo. The simplest one is in the book Self-Analysis by L. Ron Hubbard, which mostly involves one recalling pleasure moments. Later on, in Hubbard's book Handbook for Pre-Clears, he introduced a technique known as lock scanning, wherein a person can examine periods of his life where he made certain decisions, or certain events took place. This will remove a lot of so-called surface charge off of the person's case, making auditing go more smoothly, and has its own benefits as well, charge being the upset in a person's case, and a person's case being the sum of his aberrations. As Hubbard's subject progressed from Dianetics to Scientology, different kinds of auditing were introduced. Two categories of auditing, or processing, are objective and subjective processes. Objective processes have to do with communication with the environment. Subjective processes have to do with the pre-clear's mind and spiritual condition as opposed to his body and his relationship to the physical universe and other beings. Dianetics is an example of subjective processing. An example of objective processing would be what's called the CCH processes. The auditor, instead of having the pre-clear look into his mind, would have the pre-clear do things like walk around the room and touch objects, and even ask the pre-clear questions about what he is touching or looking at. These processes are intended to focus the pre-clear's attention outward, into present time, and put himself more in control of himself as opposed to the reactive mind controlling him. Those who are not capable of getting results from the repair of importances exercise in TROM will need to do the CCH processes before progressing on to level 2 of TROM. As Hubbard progressed into the subject of Scientology, the Church used the e-meter as a tool in auditing. This device sends a tiny electric current through the pre-clear's body, and when the auditor starts addressing something in the pre-clear's mind, the needle on this device will react. It will continue to react until the matter is fully addressed, and when a subject is fully handled in auditing, will go back and forth in a smooth motion. This is called a floating needle, or a float. You can also say the needle frees up. Dennis will also touch upon what are called overrun reads, which are e-meter reactions when a process is already flat, or in other words, produces no more change. That's what we mean when we flatten a process. It need not be run anymore. To run a process longer would be considered a flub, which is a Scientology term for a mistake made in an auditing session. In the lecture, Dennis will mention what are called OT levels. These are advanced spiritual states that go beyond the level of clear in Scientology, and they are known by number. The first level of OT would be OT1, the next would be OT2, and so on. Between 1961 and 1966, Dennis attended the famous St. Hilt's Special Briefing Course, which is known in Scientology as the most comprehensive course Hubbard ever had given in the history of the subject. On that course he introduced GPM theory, which I spoke of before, and his techniques for handling the goals problem mass by finding out who or what was opposing the goals of the pre-clear. The auditor would ask the pre-clear to name a goal, then ask who or what would oppose such a goal. The technique failed, and worsened many people's cases. This is one of, if not the most important aspects of Scientology technology that Dennis Stevens and his TROM technology corrects. Thank you for your patience in listening to my extensive introduction to this lecture. I hope that it will make for smoother listening and help firm up your comprehension. As always, you can post questions in the comments section of the video, or write to us at roger@bettertrom.com.
The title of this article is The Creation of TROM by Dennis H. Stevens. Anyone who has ever given serious consideration to mankind's social problems finally comes to the conclusion that their resolution ultimately depends upon the resolution of the problems of the human mind. But the resolution of the problem doesn't just consist of developing the necessary technology to resolve the human psyche. That is only a part of the solution. The major part of the solution is the application of such a technology. It's quite useless developing a technology which resolves the human psyche, resolves the problems of the human psyche, if this technology can only be applied by a highly skilled and highly trained technologist, simply because it would mean that this technology would only be available to those people who had sufficient money to afford the services of these highly trained personnel. This simply does not resolve the problem, because it would leave virtually the vast majority of humanity in exactly the same state as they're in today, and so there would be no resolution of mankind's problems. The resolution, therefore, can only come about in two ways. First of all, the technology to do the job, and the technology to do the job must be applicable in either on a co-audit basis, where people can pair up and apply the technology to each other free of charge, and so resolve their own psyche, and so regain a state of optimum sanity. Or the second option is the technology to resolve the human psyche must be able to be applied on a do-it-yourself basis. You see, the third option of it being applied by a highly trained technician, highly trained psychotherapist, highly trained technician, call him what you will, simply is not a valid option. Back in 1950, when Ron Hubbard wrote Dianetics, the Modern Science of Mental Health, he offered a co-audit route. There were, in fact, only two factors that prevented this route from being achieved. There were only two factors that prevented its achievement. One was the variability of difficulty of cases, and two was the variability of the ability of auditors. As early as 1951, long before I took professional training, I'd met a number of auditors and realised that they weren't all equal in skill. And I'd met a number of pre-clears and realised that they weren't all of equal difficulty. So I was aware of this problem back in 1951. Ron Hubbard was equally aware of the problem. He had no solution to the problem. I had no solution to the problem. We were determined the only route we could go down was the professional training route. Either that or abandon the subject. The simple truth of the matter was that good natural auditors armed with the technology of Book 1, faced with a rather easy running pre-clear, could achieve incredible results with that technology. But at the other end of the spectrum, very poor natural auditors, confronted with a very difficult cases, were going to get absolutely nowhere with that, with using that technology, or using any technology. So as Ron said in one of his articles he wrote in an early magazine that came over from America, if this subject is going to go anywhere, it can only move on the basis of professional training of auditors. I mean, his conclusion was valid, was sound. I knew it was sound at the time when I read it. It was unfortunate, but there it was. A highly trained auditor could not only handle an easy running pre-clear, but a highly trained auditor could handle a very tough pre-clear. He could handle them all, and that was the goal. We thought, well, we're going to have to go this route. It's the only route we can go. But we weren't all satisfied with the route. Ron was never satisfied with it, but it was the only way out he could see. And we used to, us professionals, I'm now going to move into 1953, 54 in London, when I was a professional Scientologist working with the central organisation. I used to talk to the fellow professionals and talk to the field auditors. We used to sit around and burn the midnight oil, and we still used to talk about this idea of co-audit and clearing the planet on a co-audit basis, but it seemed a hopeless dream. And I used to raise the idea of a do-it-yourself technology, but the mechanics of Dianetics was such that the mechanics of the human mind appeared such that a do-it-yourself was out of the question. By the mechanics of the reactive mind, analytical mind theory, which was validated and can be validated by anyone who cares to examine it. It was not just an unvalidated theory of L. Ron Hubbard's. This can be validated and has been validated over and over again. It is true. It is true. There are such things as engrams. And it is true that these engrams do re-stimulate and cut the analytical mind out of circuit and enforce upon the person aberrative behaviour. And that the subject, the pre-clear, in the presence of these highly charged aberrative incidents, his analytical mind will shut down and so prevent him from handling the incidents himself. In other words, he needs a separate therapist to guide him through these highly charged traumatic incidents. It all made a lot of sense back in 1952, 53. Ron, I knew, used to burn the midnight oil looking for another solution. But there wasn't any other solution than the one he had. He couldn't see it. None of us could see it. Yet, the simple truth always remained, and that never changed right from the outset, that if we were ever going to get a cleared planet, it could only be achieved by co-audit or on a do-it-yourself basis. There was no other way it was ever going to be done. We knew it. We all knew it, us professionals. We knew it. Anyone who thinks about it quite clearly knows it. There's no other way it can be done. It cannot be done on a paid basis. As a practicing professional Scientologist, I used to resurrect this problem about every 6 months during my career and dig it out and dust it off and see if I've got any new data that had cropped up, anything else that I could throw into the equation there. But it wasn't until a summer's evening, a very quiet and peaceful summer's evening, coming across on a Sydney Harbour ferry from Sydney across to the suburb where I lived, that I again resurrected the problem. And my mind was particularly clear that evening in the beautiful surroundings, beautiful peaceful harbour with the lights, the winking lights of the fishing boats, and the winking lights of the town, and the swish of the water, and the warm, balmy air of a Sydney summer evening. All those things must have got together because I suddenly began to get down to it and said, well, now, what are the factors involved here? What exactly is involved here? I started to think about the problem, but this time with an intensity which I'd never thought about before. This, of course, meant questioning Ron's analysis of the problem. Ron's conclusion was that there had to be a separate therapist. That was his conclusion on the basis of the evidence, and everything seemed to point that he was right. So I had to question this. Was this so, or did it just appear to be so? Was there some apparency here? So when I got home that evening, I went to my study and took out a sheet of paper. I started to write down exactly what an auditor does, what his function is in a session. Then I wrote down on another sheet of paper exactly what the pre-clear does in a session and what his function is in the session. And said to myself, well, if it's going to be a do-it-yourself therapy, then the pre-clear, or the subject, is going to have to do both. He's going to have to be able to do the auditor's role and the pre-clear's role simultaneously. But how on earth can he do this when he's dealing with his reactive bank, and his reactive bank is going to cut out his analytical mind? So I put that to one side with a question mark and said to myself, well, just what is this factor called restimulation? Well, it's an incident from the past moving out of the past into the present and affecting the person's analytical mind in the present, to the extent of cutting out the analytical mind completely. So it's some past traumatic incident moving into the present, and to a greater or lesser extent influencing the analytical reasoning faculty of the human mind. That is what we call restimulation. So I said to myself, right, what can we do about this? Then I recalled one of Ron's great discoveries. I regard it as one of Ron's great discoveries. It tends these days to get somewhat lost amongst the many great discoveries he made, but I've always regarded it as one of Ron's better discoveries. And this is the datum that if you can get the pre-clear to do consciously that which his mind does automatically, he will regain control of this function of his psyche. So I said to myself, could it be that we can crack this problem if we get the person on a do-it-yourself basis learns how to take things out of his past and bring them into the present, and take them back out into the past again, bring them into the present. So he learns how to do, in other words, he starts to learn how to do consciously what his reactive mind does automatically. He starts to take over the automaticity. Suddenly, I knew I'd cracked it. That was the missing datum. That was the missing datum. That was what Ron had never thought of. That the analytical part of the psyche can duplicate exactly what the reactive mind can do. It can create, you see, the analytical faculty has at its disposal the creative faculty of the whole psyche, of the whole spiritual being, is available to the analytical faculty. So the analytical part of the mind can simulate, can create, can bring about, can mock up, can do exactly what the reactive part of the mind is doing. But evidently the analytical part of the mind has decided not to do this. But nevertheless, it can learn how to do it, or relearn how to do it. And I think it was about 1:30 in the morning then. And I thought, I've done it. I knew I'd done it. I hadn't even got the technique. But that wasn't going to be difficult. Devising the technique was easy. So the next day I got to work and started to work on a technique for it. Well, it wasn't long before I spotted exactly what needed to be done. And this became the first step of the do-it-yourself procedure. This is the first step of TROM. I then started to apply this to myself. I tested it. It needed to be testing. And it didn't need any modification. It was correct. It was exactly right. And it did the trick. I learnt to take over the automaticity of my own reactive bank. Oh yes, it was painful. Oh yes, it was restimulative. That bank didn't give in easily. But finally it quit. And I was back in charge. And what do I mean I was back in charge? Well, I could cock a snook at my bank. There was nothing it could throw at me that I couldn't handle. Because I could, you see, I could do what it was doing. I could do consciously what it was doing any old time. You see, it was stimulating engrams. Okay, so could I. I could do what it was doing, you see. So it had no power over me anymore. This was proved by the e-meter. The e-meter was just sitting there idling. I could think anywhere, all over my past. Nothing moved. You see that? I could now do what my own bank did. I'd broken the automaticity. That was the first step. The second step, step 2, followed immediately from step 1. It was a completely natural extension of the abilities regained at step 1. And this became step 2. I won't give these, what these techniques were or what these were at step 1 or step 2, because you will find them written up in TROM. And if I mention them, I'm going to have to explain them, and I'm going to have to end up presenting the whole of TROM in this article, which I simply cannot do. So you'll have to get TROM to find out what these things are. I then ran step 2, absolutely flat. Absolutely flat. And achieved much more case gain. Step 2. The case gain on step 2 was serenity, was calmness, enormous mental calmness. That at any time I wanted to, I could simply become completely calm, completely and utterly calm at a moment's notice at any old time. And when I put myself on the meter when I was calm, the needle was simply floating. I could do this instantly, with no problem at all. Bang, just like that. That was the end. That was the end point of step 2. By this point, the e-meter, I had to abandon the use of the e-meter because it was no longer recording. It was no longer doing anything for me. I discovered at this point that my knowledge, my own sense of what was happening in my mind was equal to what the e-meter could tell me. In other words, my perception of my mind was equal to the e-meter's perception of my mind. So the e-meter could tell me nothing that I didn't know myself. I quickly discovered that this was the way it was, because every time I was getting a read, just an instant before I'd get the read, I'd know what the read was. Then when I looked at it, realised what the read was, spotted it, the read would go off the meter. Then it'd be, when there was no read on the meter, my mind was completely blank and I was just in present time. And just an instant before the needle moved, I'd know why the meter was going to move. So I was always a step ahead of the meter, and I realised then I didn't need the meter anymore. So I put the meter aside. And I've never used a meter since. There's no point in it. Step 1 and step 2 cures you from the use of an e-meter. You simply don't need it after that. Simply because you're more sensitive. Your mind, your analytical faculty is more sensitive than even the most highly sensitive e-meter is. Which is what you would expect. That life is more perceptive than any mechanical device. I really thought at this point that I've got as far as it's possible to go. So I said to myself, well, where do we go from here? Well, I've quickly realised that if I was going to tell people about this technology, I had to find out if other people could use the technology. And that meant, was there a bottom level below which, or a case level below which a person couldn't work solo? Yes, there was. I knew there was. I knew that from the technology that there was such a level. And knowing what this level was, I quickly devised an auditing command which a person could use to determine if they were above or below this level. And this becomes the new level 1, and the old level 1 now became level 2, and the old level 2 now became level 3. So when you look at the modern TROM, you'll find that the level 1 is a check level to find out if the person is sufficiently mentally stable to run solo. And if they are, they go on to level 2, and then go on to level 3. And where do they go if they're not mentally stable, sufficiently mentally stable? Well, first of all, how far down does the new level 2 go, and so forth? And what is how stable does a person have to be before they can work? Well, it's not very high. The test is the old. Do you remember the old CCH levels? Well, if a person needs the CCHs running, the old CCH processes run, then they should run those processes first, and then go on to level 2. So now, from my own experience and as an practicing auditor, and the experience of other auditors, and what Ron said on the subject, there's only a very, very tiny proportion of humanity who need the CCHs running before they can do a subjective process. It's a very, very tiny proportion. I don't know. It's something like 5%. That doesn't mean to say that 95% of cases are easy cases. Because the world's full of tough cases that don't need the CCHs running, I can assure you. It's wrong. It's a technical flub to identify difficult cases with cases that need the CCHs running. Some of the toughest cases I've ever come across ran through the CCHs like a well-oiled dream. That was not their problem. Now, the interesting thing is that once the person's completed the CCHs, they then go back and do level 1 of TROM, and they'll now find that they're above the level. They'll pass the test, in other words. The check level at level 1, but they will now go through the check level and pass the test, and they can now go on to level 2, and they're on their way. So for 95% of the human race can start straight in at level 2. 5% will have to have the CCHs run by a separate therapist. That may take many hours if they're psychotic, depending upon the severity of their case condition. Or it may just take a few hours. It just depends of how badly they need the CCHs running. But nevertheless, once the CCHs have gone flat, the person can now do level 1. They will find that they are above the level, and they can now successfully go on and do level 2 and level 3, and they're on their way. In other words, they can say goodbye to a separate therapist once the CCHs have gone flat. That's the 5% I'm talking about. The other 95% don't even need to run the CCHs. They can go straight in and do level 1. Pass it, go on to level 2, they're on their way. Well, I found myself sitting at the top of level 3 and wondering where else to go. Floating needle. Thumbing idly through all the techniques I knew of Dianetics and Scientology. I skimmed through Creation of Human Ability. All the R2 processes I checked out. Every one of them was flat. Every one of them. Checked them all out. They're all flat. They'd all gone flat while I was doing level 2 and level 3. They'd all gone flat. And so I thought, well, where do I go from here? I started to dig out more old Scientology and old Dianetic processes, and they were all flat. I thought, my God, is there anywhere I can go? Is there anywhere I go from here? And the only things that were interesting me was this subject of purposes and postulates. That was the only thing I could get flickers on flickers in my psyche, or flickers on the e-meter. The only thing I could get a flicker on was on raw postulates. Raw postulates, goals, purposes. I could get flickers on those. Everything else, I was simply in present time. I'm just a being in present time. So I started to work. If there's any further I can go, it must be on purposes and goals. So I went over and reviewed everything I'd learnt on the subject of goals and purposes from the St. Hill briefing course, which I'd done in the 1960s, early 1960s. And sadly to say, none of that helped. Not a bit of it was any use. It all ended up in a waste paper basket. It was a dead loss. I was back on my own again, learning how to handle postulates in conflict. And I found out how to do it, how to handle postulates in conflict. And then I found out that Ron Hubbard had never learned how to do it. That was the awful thing. So all during the 60s, when he'd done all that work on postulates in conflict, there was a certain fundamental truth on the subject he hadn't spotted. And it made some of those processes that he developed quite dangerous. That's why they'd all gone in the wastepaper basket. Once I found out how to do it, I realised that what I'd learned at St Hill was for the birds. It was so much hogwash. So I developed my own techniques for handling postulates in conflict. Started to create goals packages, see what the true goals packages look like. Yes, I found them and learned how to take them apart. And you'll find this. This is the technology at level 4 and level 5 in TROM. This particular research on goals and so forth took me about a year to iron out the technology. It turned out to be a lot more complex than I thought it was going to be. It was a much tougher nut to crack, that was, than the lower levels, or what became level 2 and level 3, level 1, 2 and 3. They were comparatively easy. The levels 4 and 5, well, 4 was okay because that was a preliminary step. It was 5 was the toughie. That was the tough one, to learn how to get the bugs out of it, learn how to do it exactly right. I understood why Ron had failed in 1960. His efforts were valiant. He was almost doomed to fail. He was doomed to fail. For example, I'll tell you why he was doomed to fail. The actual legs, the actual postulates of the true GPMs aren't in the bank. They're in the analytical mind. That's why you can't find them in the bank. That's why if you go searching in the bank for the GPMs, you'll simply come up with a mishmash of wrong opposes. And you'll do it all wrong. You'll upset the pre-clear. So Ron was doomed to fail. He didn't know that. I didn't know it for a long while. Till suddenly the penny dropped one day. That the true postulates, the true GPMs, the true postulates of the true GPMs aren't in the bank. It's an analytical construct. So they're in the analytical mind. All that's in the bank is the mishmash of wrong opposes. The lies. There's only the lies in the bank, you see. The bank only consists of lies. The truth is in the analytical mind. So the mistake Ron made on the subject of goals was to look in the bank for the truth. He tried to find the GPM by looking into a mass of lies. Well, when you look into a mass of lies, you only find lies. That's why he never found the true GPMs. He only found lies. And that's why they never came apart. That's why the search went on forever. That's why he nearly killed himself in the 1960s. It was a mistake he was almost doomed to make. It was a mistake almost anyone would make. I nearly made it. So I jumped the whole lot in the wastepaper basket. I realised it was darn near killing me too. Started off afresh. Spotted where the truth was. Then I got level 5 out. Well, level 5 had a preliminary step, level 4, which is really just an introduction to level 5. Just sort of cleaning up the charge off the major goals in this lifetime. Sort of lock scanning them, you might say. That's level 4. Take some of the surface charge off before you get down to the nitty-gritty. The postulates themselves, that's level 5. About halfway through, after I got the level 5 technology sorted out, I was running it because it was taking me a long time to flatten it, long time to work with it, long time to get it flat. I was working, I was about halfway through. I didn't know I was about halfway through, but in retrospect, I was about halfway through. And one day, an old Scientology chum of mine phoned up and said he got his paws on all Ron's upper level OT levels. he's got his paws on everything, right up to the top of OT7. Or was it OT8? I'm not sure, OT7, OT8. Anyway, right up to the top, he got the lot. Was I interested? I said, yes, I was interested. So he dumped the whole lot on my lap. And I took a rest from doing my own auditing to go through, check through every one of these levels. OT1 right the way through. It was to OT7. Yeah, right the way through. I'm pretty certain it was OT7. Yeah, right the way through OT1. I checked OT1. Yep, that was flat. I got onto OT2. Oh, that's interesting. What's going on here? Nothing. Flat. The only reads, I put myself back on the meter for this because it seemed to need a meter. Put myself back on the meter, and the only meter movement I was getting was overrun reads. I was trying to make a process work that was flat. OT2 was flat. So I went on to OT3. I couldn't make it work. It was all flat. And so on. I just went through level by level, checked it, ran it. Floating needle to start with. As soon as I started to run the process, the needle started to tighten. Oh, what do we got here? Overrun? Yes. Needle frees up. Float. Oh, there. I'm trying to run a flat process. Overrun. Dump this one. Next one. Right the way through. Right the way through to OT7. Then back from 7, right the way through back to 1 again. Recheck them all over again. Exactly the same. Nothing in any of them. All flat. All flat. Now that was interesting. That really shook me rigid. That really shook me, that did. Because here I was just halfway through my own upper level tech. I hadn't flattened it all by any means. And here I was, there, the best that Ron knew was flat already on my case. So I was ahead of him. Technically, I was ahead of him, and I was working solo. I wasn't working with a separate therapist. I was working solo. Yeah, I was technically ahead of what he got to offer. I later on discovered the upper levels above 7, and every one of those that I ever managed to get my paws on, they were flat too. So there's nothing in Dianetics and Scientology that would do anything for me. Even before I'd finished level 5, my own level 5. So the next thing I did, I started to type up TROM. Started to get it put together from my research notes and get it into a typed up form for passing on to the rest of humanity. Because this looked too good. This looked too good to lose. And, well, the rest, as they say, you know. The biggest difficulty a person will have with TROM, I can tell you right away, is getting started. Getting your feet wet. Getting your feet wet. The reason for this is very, very simple. That the average person has fought themselves to a standstill playing games with their own mind. They've been overwhelmed by their own reactive bank. So they will not touch it. They will not touch their mind. Their experience is that every time they try and do something about their own mind, they get overwhelmed. They lose. So they've learnt to keep away from it. They'll let a separate therapist tamper with it, but they won't tamper with it themselves. They're scared witless to touch their own mind. That they're just a quivering jelly of shaking fear of their own bank. The cure for this is level 2 and level 3 of TROM. There is no other cure. A separate therapist cannot give you this cure. Even if you were to do level 2 and level 3 with a separate therapist, you still would not be cured of your fear of your bank, because you'd still have the dependency upon the separate therapist. When you finish level 3, you can cock a snook at your reactive bank. When you finish level 3 solo. But you will not ever get there. Never achieve this state while you work with a separate therapist. You've got to break it. And you'll never get level 5 flat without doing it solo. Level 5 in TROM. Well, I don't know whether it's theoretically runnable with a separate therapist, but I don't think the therapist could move fast enough for you to be able to follow what you're doing, you know. And I just don't think it would ever go flat, because while you had a dependency upon the separate therapist to tell you what to do, you never get the process flat. In other words, you've got to break this dependency at level 2, level 3. You've got to break this dependency upon a separate therapist. You've got to be able to cock a snook at your own bank. And you learn that at level 2, level 3. After that, you do level 4, level 5. What about level 6? There isn't one. There's no level 6. Level 5's the works. Doesn't go any further than that. I don't know of a level 6. But I've looked. I'm still looking. But I don't know of a level 6. I sometimes gather what I think I've got is level 6. I get it out and realise that it's only subdivisions of levels 2, 3, 4, or 5. It really belongs in there. It doesn't belong anymore. So I've got it. I know I've got it. It's self-checking, you see. I know I've solved the problem. It's there. But your biggest problem will be to get started. You'll love TROM when you read it. You'll sit around with your friends, and the urge will be to sit and talk about TROM forever. And talk about it, and talk about it, and talk about it, and talk about it, and never do it. Well, I have a message for you. I have news for you. You'll never be totally free of your bank until you get in at level 1 and start to learn how to cock a snook at your bank. You've got to learn how to handle that bank. That means level 1. No, sorry, level 1, level 2, level 3 of TROM. Solo. You've got to be able to do it. What does it mean when you achieve this state? Can you be audited by another auditor? Oh yes, I love being audited by other auditors. They can still audit me any old time they want to. I don't mind. I don't mind. They'll have to work fast though with me, because I work very, very quickly. And my experience is that I work much, much faster solo than they can conceivably follow. And me having to try and explain to them what the hell is going on is just going to slow the progress down to a crawl. I'll do much better to do it solo. That's my experience. So that's TROM. There's the creation of TROM. Now, for the first time, we can all really achieve the goals that Ron set in 1950 in Dianetics and Modern Science of Mental Health. We can clear the planet. We can do it now on a do-it-yourself basis. We've overcome all the difficulties, you see. We have the technology to do the job. We can distribute the technology to do the job. And the technology can be applied by anyone, regardless of their amount of money they have, their income, or what have you. They can sit in the quiet of their own home, in their own time, at their own pace, and knock their bank for 6 using TROM. Well, that is... Now that, I can assure you, is something worth doing. And when you've achieved it, you can give yourself a pat on the back and say, that was a job well done. Finally, I'm sorry to have ended all the games of the professional auditors, auditing pre-clears, making a living out of it. I'm sorry. I'm just sorry. You'll just have to become experts at the CCHs, because that's about the only processes you're going to run. Everything else can be run solo with TROM. You'll just have to go elsewhere and make your living doing other things. You won't be able to make a living, once TROM gets around, you won't be able to make a living auditing people for money, I can assure you, because they'll make faster and faster gains on TROM than they can ever make working with a separate therapist. Well, that is the creation of TROM. and I wish you luck with it. And I'm very grateful to my old friend Anthony Phillips for this opportunity to be able to present this material to you. Thank you very much. P.S. Oh yes, I almost forgot. Case gains. TROM will erase all your aberrations, including any you may have on the subject of sex. You can rest assured that whatever you have after you've finished the 5 levels of TROM will not be an aberration.
The floppy disk is available. The printed version of it is available. What else do I have to do? What else do I have to do? Go around and slip copies of it under everyone's front door? I think I can say I've done enough. It's up to somebody else to pick up this subject of TROM now and run with it. God damn it, I've held it and run with it since I started doing the research on it. It's about time somebody else picked up the ball and ran with it. Maybe, Tony, in our society these days, you know, in our society in which we live, my attitude has a bit of an oldie worldy charm about it, but it's the way I feel. It's the way I feel on the subject. To use a common phrase there, the bottom line, Tony, is this: that if I thought for one moment that an article by me on the subject of TROM being printed in the Ivy magazine would cause one person to pick up the TROM and start to use it, I wouldn't hesitate. I would go out and write that article for you. I'd start writing it this evening if I thought that for one moment. But I don't think for one moment that anything I write that goes out in any magazine, including Ivy, is going to make anyone start doing TROM. It's not going to stop them doing TROM, and it isn't going to make them do TROM. It isn't going to encourage them, or it isn't going to discourage them. It's just going to be just more words that are going to sit and read so they can sit on their backsides and talk about it forever. And they're not going to get one bit of case gain until they get off their backsides and start doing TROM. It's just simple as that. You see that? About 2,500 years ago, a Chinaman called Lao Tzu is supposed to have wanted to get out of a town in China which had a wall around it. And the king had decreed at that time that the wall, the door, the gate, the main gate of the town would be closed at midnight and wouldn't be opened up till 6 o'clock in the morning. This was to keep the intruders, to keep the outlaws from bursting into the town overnight, you see. It was a walled town. So Lao Tzu wanted to get out of the town, but he arrived at 12:05 and the gate was shut. And there was nothing he could do to convince the gatekeeper to open the gate, because the gatekeeper knew that he mustn't open the gate. More than his life was worth to open that gate. So Lao Tzu sat down for 6 hours and told him the whole subject of Taoism that Lao Tzu had researched and came up with, you see. And the gatekeeper listened absolutely amazed. And eventually the sun came up, and at 6 o'clock in the morning he opened the gate, and out went Lao Tzu and was never heard of again. But the gatekeeper fortunately had remembered it all, and he passed it on. And that's how one of the great religions of China was born, Taoism. And that is the legend of Lao Tzu and Taoism and the gatekeeper. Well, there's a similar thing with TROM, I can assure you. I've done my bit, Tony. I've done my bit. You might be the gatekeeper. You and Terry and Greg Pickering might be the gatekeepers. There, you're going to have to pass it on, or to use a phrase these days, you're going to have to pick up the ball and run with it, because I'm going to disappear out into the night, mate. So you get it. You see my attitude. You see my viewpoint. My viewpoint is a tenable viewpoint. There. Lao Tzu felt he'd done his bit, you see. He walked out the town. He didn't want to have any more to do with it. He walked out the town. And he left it with the gatekeeper. But I'm leaving it with you. I'm leaving it with Greg. I'm leaving it with Terry. I'm leaving it with other people. Oh, sure, I'm always here. If somebody gets into TROM and gets into difficulties, and I'm always here to answer technical questions on the subject of TROM. But they've got to be technical questions, or they've got to be somebody needs a helping hand, who's got themselves into difficulties, and so on. I'll do that. But peddling it? No, no, no. I'm not interested. Now, does that answer your question, Tony? I've gone on the subject, waffled on at great length, but I think I've finally now got down to the bottom line, the nitty-gritty. We're now down to my ultimate reality on the subject. I'm simply not interested in peddling the subject. One of the few things, Tony, that I would appreciate in return for handing over this tech and presenting this tech and making this tech available, one of the few things I would appreciate from you in return is that if you do write any material on TROM in the Ivy magazine, if any material is written using the word TROM, any review of it, reports or what have you using TROM, that a copy of that article is posted to me as routine. I know you would actually do this. You would no doubt do this to all your authors and so forth who present material or who make material available for your magazine. So I'm sure that you would do the same for me, and I would appreciate it very much that if any material does appear in the Ivy magazine mentioning TROM, that a copy of the article is shipped off to me. You don't have to send the whole of that magazine to me. Just send me a copy of that article. But I'll be appreciate that. That keeps me in touch with what is going on. You see, there. Otherwise, I'm going to be in the embarrassing position of somebody in southern Patagonia writing to me and saying that yes, I read the article in Ivy magazine about TROM, and I have a few technical questions, and I'm going to think to myself, what article in Ivy magazine? I won't know what it is. I won't know what the hell he's talking about, you see. So, will you do that for me, Tony? I'm sure you will. Just drop me a copy of anything you print on the subject of TROM, so that keeps my R factor up. So people write to me and saying, yes, I read this article about TROM in the Ivy magazine. I say, oh yes, and they say this, that, and the other was printed, and I've got copies of it. You see, and I can always write back and say, oh no, he never printed that. I've got copies of everything printed. You see, so it makes it nice and safe for all of us. Okay, good. See, I'm getting towards the end of this tape, and I'd like to thank you very, very much for that long rundown you gave me on the subject of your Scientology career. I did appreciate it very much, Tony, and I shall certainly be pleased to add that tape to my files. That tape will go into my files. The Anthony Phillips story. The Anthony Phillips story. Well, I can't think of anything much more to say. If I get into anything else now, I'm going to run off the end of the spool, and I'm a bit of an old hand at this, and I flatly refuse to run off the end of the spool, so I'm going to say bye-bye for now, and I hope to hear from you soon. Ta-da.